Hello again. Someone sent me a video recently where Pastor Tommy McMurtry talks about his interpretation of the spirits in prison in 1 Peter 3. Now, I've talked about this before, and this is not a video about the spirits in prison. This is about proper interpretation of a passage. And listen, there's only one interpretation of a passage. There may be a number of applications, but there's only one interpretation. And we could even disagree on the interpretation. You might think a passage means something different than me because you think a certain word or phrase is saying one thing and I think it's saying something else. We might both be wrong. A phrase like baptized for the dead in 1 Corinthians 15 could be taken multiple ways because the words baptize, for, and dead all have multiple meanings in the scriptures. However, there's only one correct interpretation of what this phrase means. But we derive our interpretation of the passage based on the context of the passage and our developed understanding of Bible words. Moreover, we should interpret the passage of the scripture by taking the literal, normal understanding of the words in the context in which it appears, unless, of course, it's an obvious figure of speech, such as when Jesus calls Herod a fox. Okay, obviously Herod's not a fox. In most cases, the Bible will tell you when things being said are parables, allegories, or symbolic for something else right in the same passage. You don't have to go outside the context of the passage to determine the meaning of things said within the passage. The meaning of what is being said can be understood directly from the passage that it's in. And like I said, if the normal understanding of the word or what is being said is not being used, that will usually be very clear from the passage. For example, when Jesus told the Jews in John chapter 6 to eat his flesh and drink his blood for eternal life, he clarified to them that that meant to believe on him. And he told them the words he spoke unto them were spirit. He was using this illustration to compare himself to the manna that their fathers ate in the wilderness, which sustained their physical life, while he is a sustenance of spiritual life. In cases where words with multiple meanings, such as evil, are used, the meaning to be applied can be determined from the context of the passage. And finally, prophetic passages are different. And in these cases, we're talking about something written historically where the literal fulfillment comes later, or there are multiple literal applications, such as Hosea 11:1, where it says, when Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. Literally talking about the Jews historically coming out of Egypt, and Jesus Christ prophetically. Now, I may come off sound a little rude at times because the methodology Tommy is using and the basic English grammar that he willfully ignores to teach what he's teaching is just really bad. And that's kind of a shame because I think Tom's a nice guy. I think he's a good guy. I think he's trying to help folks. I think he's usually genuine. I've listened to a lot of his, not a lot, I should say, some. I've listened to some of his sermons. And when he preaches on, practical Christian living stuff, family, marriage, doing right, it's honestly very good. He's, very good on that stuff. And I will say that some of the things he's talking about in 1 Peter, like suffering for rewards and staying out of sin, living for God, all good stuff, all good stuff. But it doesn't excuse the terrible methods used to teach the literal meaning of the verses in question. Now what he does here in 1 Peter 3 is he goes outside the context of the passage to pull something in from another passage that it's totally unrelated, really. And at the beginning of the video, he says that, let's allow Peter to explain to us exactly what he's talking about. But since you can't really actually get Tommy's, understanding of what Peter is talking about from Peter, he has to take you outside of Peter to Luke 4, when Jesus preached to the Jews in the temple and make the spirits in prison to be Jews in bondage to the law. And then he makes association of the captives in Luke 4 to the spirits in prison in 1 Peter 3. Folks, this is not how you obtain an understanding of things in the Bible. There's no reason here to allegorize spirits in prison to mean something else, literal, elsewhere in the scriptures. This is, what do they call it? It's terrible hermeneutics, which is, how you, understand the Bible. And different people use different hermeneutics, but what I'm talking about is reading the passage literally and normally. How would you understand something reading the passage with a normal understanding and a literal understanding of the words in the passage? So now you might be able to make an application of the spirits in prison to that situation of the Jews in temple, or to yourself being like delivered from the prison of sin, so to speak. There's that's what I'm talking about when there's different applications to be made. In almost every passage in the Bible, there's some sort of application, when you think about it, what's going on, to be applied to yourself. It says that these things were written for our learning. So, there's always an application to be made. That's my point. But this is extremely sloppy and irresponsible as a Bible teacher to use this method to say that this is the literal interpretation of the passage. Then he goes to John 8 to try to superimpose that language into the meaning of the text in 1 Peter 3. And although John 8 is talking about Jews being in bondage spiritually, you can't take the context and dump it into 1 Peter 3, okay? If we teach the Bible this way, we can make all sorts of things up. Like I could say, when Jezebel was eaten by the dogs in 2 Kings, right? That's really what that is, folks, is that's an allegory for a group of hungry Gentiles in the area that came in and ate her corpse. Okay, no, listen, hear me out, because Jesus referred to the Gentiles as dogs, okay, in Matthew 15, and in Psalm 22, when it speaks of Christ, it says in verse 16, "For the dogs compassed me, and the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet." So, who is this talking about, these dogs? Well, it's the Romans, of course, the Gentiles who pierced Jesus' hands and feet that are called dogs. So, we see then that we can take this understanding of dogs and apply it to the dogs that ate Jezebel, right? Well, no, that's ridiculous. That's completely ridiculous. However, it's less ridiculous than saying these spirits mean Jews, because at least we have an application of dogs referring to Gentiles elsewhere in the scripture. So you could make stuff up like this all the time. Now, the vast majority of times the spirits in the Bible refers to angels, good or bad. And rarely will the plural use refer to part of a mortal being, such as spirits of all flesh, or the spirits of just men, spirits of the prophets. Some people think spirits in 1 John refers to people when it says to try the spirits. But I think that really refers to the supernatural influence behind the person speaking. But anyway, my point is, I can't really think of any instances in the Bible where spirits refers to a mortal person as a whole, let alone specifically Jews. So, it really makes no sense at all to take that position in this passage. when you don't have that historically, as you've developed your understanding of spirits reading through the scriptures. He also changes how you would normally understand the word dead in 1 Peter 4:6, and rather, applies it as a symbolic term to specifically mean Gentiles, pulling from Ephesians 2, trying to say that the Gentiles exclusively are the ones called dead in sins. But he misses the fact that Paul, a Jew, includes himself in the camp of dead in sins in verse 5. So, and when you're trying to, and this is like an example of when you're trying to reinforce a bad teaching, you end up proof texting and missing stuff that obviously makes it look silly, like that. So while dead does mean spiritually dead in some instances, it's not a term used exclusively for Gentiles who are spiritually dead. For all are dead in sins and trespasses. But even to use the word dead here to mean spiritually dead doesn't really make any sense, because it says that the gospel was preached also to them that are dead, meaning the gospel was preached to someone else as well. If you're using dead in a spiritual sense, then using the word also here is redundant, because the spiritually dead is who the gospel is preached to. So it's alluding that it was preached to someone else. So realizing this, he has to make the spirits in prison exclusively Jews, and the dead in 1 Peter 4 exclusively Gentiles, to try to pull this off. But notice what Peter says. The guy who's going to explain the passage to us that we haven't learned anything from yet. Peter, a Jew, includes himself as part of those who wrought the will of the Gentiles. Just look at verse 3 there. 1 Peter 4:3, I think it is. Let me bring that up. I'll read it. Where's that? Okay, 1 Peter 4:3. He says, this is Peter writing, "For the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lasciviousness, lust, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries." So, Peter's including himself there in the group that he's talking about. So that can't be the understanding that it's referring to just Gentiles that are that way. So again, the application of dead to the Gentiles specifically is just a terrible error. And then halfway through the video, he kind of acts like this is all like cut and dry, like everybody should understand this. But notice that he couldn't use the passage to explain what he was trying to teach about the passage. He had to take words and phrases from other contexts and apply them here. And then the worst part is next. He says the wording in 1 Peter 3:20 is difficult. Well, I agree. It's extremely difficult if you are trying to make it say what he wants it to mean. He says this one verse talking about Noah causes the people to connect the events that took place at that time to the preaching to the spirits in prison. And to that I say, yes, that is the normal application of English grammar and punctuation as you read that passage. Do you see the semicolon there in verse 19? Okay, that's telling you that what follows is closely related to what directly preceded it. Verse 19 and verse 20 are directly correlated. The which in verse 20 is a relative pronoun referring to the spirits in prison. And then the comma when is telling us the time period the disobedience occurred. It doesn't say just like or even as. The Bible often uses the terms even as when comparing similar things. It doesn't say that. it says when. He's not using Noah as an illustration for God saving us from wrath. He's using it to tell you the time period the spirits were disobedient. Additionally, we could say he's using, he being Peter, is using it as a segue to connect with baptism in the last 2 verses of the chapter. But this is really just a poor Bible teaching overall. If we can't all abide by basic understanding of Bible words and the rules of English grammar, then we really can't have a conversation about what things mean in the scriptures, because we can just make up whatever meanings we want things to have, and pull our ideas from this passage or that and slap it in there. You can't do that. You have to play by the rules of the English language, or there's no point in talking to you about the Bible. I can't learn any doctrinal stuff from you because you just make words mean whatever and ignore what it's saying if you don't like what it's saying, or you don't think it makes sense. Finally, you really have to ask yourself, if I'm the only person teaching something a certain way, am I right? Is there something maybe that I'm missing? This is not to say that being in the minority alone means that someone's incorrect. Okay, that could just be that's just a logical fallacy to think that way, just because someone's in the minority and not the majority that's wrong. But we aren't talking about a minority position on this topic. We're talking about something being novel, really. I've done a lot of digging around on this topic. I've listened to a lot of teachings on it, and I haven't found a single other person teaching the spirits in prison or Jews in the temple. And you know why? Because it's wrong. People will come up with all kinds of goofy teachings about different things in the Bible simply because they don't think what it plainly says, quote unquote, makes sense. There are a lot of things going on in the spiritual world, or that God does, that doesn't make sense. So our job is not always to make sense, just believe what God says. And when you don't, you can end up making some foolish mistakes that even a child wouldn't make with the scriptures. And so there's a possibility the way that I see the passage is wrong, but one thing I'm 100% on is that Tom's definitely wrong. So Tom, if you happen to watch this, I hope that you'll change your mind about how you're interpreting this passage. And I'm not saying that you have to agree with me or you're wrong, but the way you're handling the words and the English to try to teach this is just really bad. It's just wrong. So if you're teaching this way, if you're handling the scriptures this way to get this understanding or interpretation, whatever you want to call it, out of it, you're probably going to do that same thing on other stuff too. It just makes you really unreliable to look to as a teacher, because you can't just make stuff up and make things be allegories for other stuff you want it to be, when there's no reason to do that. So anyway, that's all I got for this video. I'll be coming out with more Israel stuff in the near future as time permits, but shouldn't be too much of a gap. It's just preparing the notes and stuff. We'll be talking about Ezekiel, the temple in Ezekiel, and people get stuff mixed up about that because of different things going on there, like sacrifices, and we'll talk about Zechariah, Joel. And there's all kind of stuff in the Bible about that just shows that there's a plan for a physical nation of Israel later on, and you can ignore it if you want to, but that just ends up making you wrong. Anyway, I'll be coming out with some of that stuff later. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.